At such a young age, your exposure, your insight, your depth of thought given to such a huge subject matter. Tell us a little bit about that, because obviously you had very strong convictions. And I'd like to know how your family felt when you got expelled from Queen's College as well.
Actually, they were very supportive.
Interesting.
Because, they saw it as a point of principle. What I'd done, I was head boy at QC. I had finished SAC. I had completed my full 5 years there. I was class valedictorian, did very well there. But I had to go to QC to do my A-levels because I wanted to do law. And St. Augustine's was an American school. They didn't offer A-levels, so I went to QC and to do A-levels. And I became head boy there. And as head boy, I had to make a commencement day address. And in the address, I basically dealt with three things. One was that I decried the lack of Bahamianization of the curriculum. I said, we all know the depth and length of the Thames River, but we don't know anything about the Bahamas.
Absolutely.
Right? And went on in that vein. And I also decried the lack of Bahamianization of the teaching staff. All of the teachers were English, right? And I said this was unacceptable. And thirdly, I said that QC was a very privileged kind of school, straddling a very well-to-do, affluent community on the village roadside.
For sure.
And east of that. But on the other side was Kemp Road.
That's right.
And I said I thought that the school had to have a greater sense of social consciousness. And in particular, it ought to make its facilities available after school hours to kids in the Kemp Road area. Because there had been a controversy about kids from Kemp Road wanting to come to play basketball.
Hi, Loretta. Good morning.
Good morning, Franklyn. It's awfully good to be in your presence again.
As you know, it's always my privilege to be with you and to be another one of these Butler Legacy podcasts. I've been truly excited. Just the feedback we continue to get from all of our wonderful guests who continue to tune in to the work that we're doing here. As you know, the 50th anniversary of our independence is right around the corner, July 10th. And just to hear the feedback.
I love it. And, interestingly, today, we actually have a new location. We are in the main art gallery of the Bahamas. We're downstairs in the Current. And I must say, all of the spaces here are phenomenal. So I'm very happy to be in the Current today. And I must also take this opportunity to thank Bahamas for being one of our sponsors, and also, of course, the Butler Legacy Foundation for being our sponsor as well. Today is going to be a very exciting show. We've got an amazing guest, and obviously he's one of those persons whom I admire tremendously because of his depth of knowledge when it comes to the history of the Bahamas.
Absolutely. And so, before we let you introduce our wonderful guests, we just want to thank all of our patrons, those who continue to follow the Butler Legacy podcast, for joining us. I mean, we have a wonderful guest today, but we always have wonderful guests on our show. And really what we've been focused on is telling stories, really trying to focus on using our story of the Butler family to inspire, to provide engagement, and encourage other legacy families to take control of their stories. 50 years later, not everybody is going to remember. And so we want to invite you, all of you out there who have stories, who know what has happened to build this country, to do whatever you can to tell your story, to make sure that the story is not lost. And I think without any further ado, I think it's a great opportunity if you introduce our guest.
Well, I certainly will. But I must say that, one of the things that I have found since we started this podcast is the more that people are engaged in watching this, the more names come forward.
Absolutely.
The more times people are saying, you really should tap into this particular individual. So it is such a privilege today for me to be able to introduce, as I said, someone whom I greatly admire for his depth of knowledge when it comes to history. We have none other than one of our leading legal minds in the Bahamas. I like the fact that he was actually a rebel very early in life, and he was expelled from school. But obviously, most brilliant people, they go through these sort of things. And so I want to say today it is our distinct honor to have with us King's Counsel and notable historian and published author, none other than Mr. Sean McWeeney.
Mr. McWeeney, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
I know you, have a tendency to probably start off shy, so let me just give our audience a couple of facts that we've highlighted on who Mr. McWeeney is. So Sean McWeeney QC served as Attorney General for the Bahamas from January 1989 to August 1992. He also served as a senator from 1985 to 1992 and leader of the government in the Senate. Mr. McWeeney was called to the Bahamas Bar in 1978 and admitted to the inner bar as Queen's Counsel in 2009. He is a senior partner in Graham Thompson, one of the nation's largest and oldest law firms. Mr. McWeeney's political involvement dates back to 1969, when at the age of 16, he was elected president of Unicom, something I got to learn about at his recent lecture series with Sir Franklyn. Then the leading pro-independence, radical left-wing pressure group, which famously burned the Union Jack on Clifford Park during the Queen's birthday celebrations in 1969 as a protest against colonialism. In 1970, Mr. McWeeney again became embroiled in a major public controversy when he was expelled from Queen's College following an inflammatory public address as head boy, criticizing the lack of Bahamianization of both the school faculty and the curriculum. Mr. McWeeney was elected the national chairman of the governing Progressive Liberal Party in 1984 and served 5 terms. In August 2002, Mr. McWeeney was appointed the chairman of the Constitutional Commission, the body mandated to review and recommend changes to the Constitution of the Bahamas in advance of the country's 40th anniversary of independence in 2013. The best word to describe him is a rebel.
And it's interesting because that's just a literal snapshot of the diversity of our guest today. But, Sean, I want to ask you, with all of your accomplishments, with all of the great things that you've done, I want to take you back to those early days. I'd like for you, because what people may not know is that in all of your conversations about Bahamianization, your dad was a British subject, if I'm correct.
American,
yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And of course, I would like to hear a little bit about your involvement with Unicom.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I think it's because of Sir Franklyn Wilson that I got involved in Unicom. I was involved in a high school debate at what was then the government high school, where UB is now. And after the debate, Sir Franklyn, or Frankie Wilson as he is to me, my very, very dear friend, came up to me and told me about this organization, Unicom, and invited me to join, which I did. I was 16, and a year later I was president. I was the youngest guy by far. I mean, because, Frankie and all the other guys were like 7, 8, some cases 10 years older than I was. But I became president, and it was very much the leading left-wing organization of its day. We were the first group to consistently call for independence. This would have been like in the late 60s, early 70s. And then it became fashionable to call for it. But we were the first group, not the first persons to do it, mind you, because people like Randolph Fawkes and I think Carl Francis and Loftus Roker and certainly A.D. Hanna had periodically called for it. But I think we were the first group to develop a consistent drumbeat, calling for independence.
At such a young age, your exposure, your insight, your depth of thought given to such a huge subject matter. Tell us a little bit about that, because obviously you had very strong convictions. And I'd like to know how your family felt when you got expelled from Queen's College as well.
Actually, they were very supportive.
Interesting.
Because they saw it as a point of principle. What I'd done, I was head boy at QC. I had finished SAC. I'd completed my full 5 years there. I was class valedictorian, did very well there. But I had to go to QC to do my A-levels because I wanted to do law. And St. Augustine's was an American school. They didn't offer A-levels, so I went to QC and to do A-levels. And I became head boy there. And as head boy, I had to make a commencement day address. And in the address, I basically dealt with three things. One was that I decried the lack of Bahamianization of the curriculum. I said, you know, we all know the depth and length of the Thames River, but we don't know anything about the Bahamas.
Absolutely.
Right? And went on in that vein. And I also decried the lack of Bahamianization of the teaching staff. All of the teachers were English, right? And I said this was unacceptable. And thirdly, I said that QC was a very privileged kind of school, straddling a very well-to-do, affluent community on the village roadside.
For sure.
And east of that. But on the other side was Kemp Road.
That's right.
And I said I thought that the school had to have a greater sense of social consciousness. And in particular, it ought to make its facilities available after school hours to kids in the Kemp Road area. Because there had been a controversy about kids from Kemp Road wanting to come to play basketball and not being allowed to do it. This was after school was finished.
Right.
So those were the three things I dealt with.
So, you know, this
sounds pretty tame now, but it created quite a firestorm.
But it's so interesting because here you have head boy giving the final commencement exercise. Literally, I'm not sure he actually could have been expelled. You would have been finished by that point.
No, this was remember I became head boy in the year I went there.
Oh, okay.
So, and I was there for 2 years. So this was at the end of my first year.
Got you. So yeah. So
this was in the summer of 1970.
How did you complete your A levels?
I never did. That was the end of my formal education.
Oh my goodness.
I never went to college. I never did the A levels, and that's why I ended up doing my articles here. I never went to London. I did my articles of clerkship, studied law entirely here. Yeah.
That is amazing. So if we were to actually look at all of the things that you articulated, that you stood for, that you actually brought to the consciousness, if you will, of persons in your age group and persons perhaps older than you, I guess what I'd like to know is this was a natural progression then to your political career.
Yes, very much so, because Unicom was a very independent pressure group, as I said, not affiliated with any party. But what happened was Sir Franklin, Frankie Wilson, decided he wanted to go into frontline politics for the PLP. And that created a crisis for the organization. Some, like myself, decided we wanted to, follow Frankie's example and also affiliate with the PLP. There were others who wanted to affiliate with what was then the Free PLP, which would soon morph into the FNM. Right. People like Dwight Sawyer and our organization is a good example of that. And he later became chairman of the FNM. Right. And then there were others who wanted to associate with what was left of the NDP, the National Democratic Party, which was Paul Adley's party. And a few went and joined that. So...
But what about the John McCartneys of the world?
John came a little bit later. John came a little bit later. He wasn't. He was there, but not during the critical period that I'm. Well, sorry, he wasn't in this critical period. Yeah, John was there because John was the guy who led a fourth movement. Remember, some are going to the PLP, some are going to the Free PLP, some are going to the NDP. But John had this great idea to form his own party, the Vanguard Nationalist and Socialist Party. And so that's what happened. Another part of the group went and did that.
Interesting.
But that was the end of Unicom, really.
That was the end of Unicom. But Unicom, Franklyn, was such an influential body, if you will. If you look at the characters that Sean spoke to and those individuals, they were a huge part of our transformation from colonialism to Bahamianization.
Yeah. Very much so. Yeah.
But you see, this was that young grouping that, persons like our grandfather, he was not a scholar.
Agreed.
He was not a university student or anything like that. but he was a civil activist.
Absolutely.
But this younger generation that came behind, especially after the change of 1967, and they had been exposed to tertiary education abroad, they became almost like the action magnets, if you will, of the progressive liberal movement.
Right.
Later, the Progressive Liberal Party.
Yeah.
That's correct. And you remember, this was the age of revolt all over the world.
Absolutely.
The late 60s, early 70s, the student movement was at the height of its power, really, in the United States, in France, in the UK. So the Bahamas was very much a part of this international mosaic.
But you were before your time. I'll say, and I say that simply because at the age of 16, Unicom had not yet come into being, and you had already determined as a young man that it was important for the institution of Queen's College, which probably just a few years before allowed people of our hue
into it,
to in there.
That's
but
right.
you were an agitator, if you will, to ensure that they became more of a social partner. Because geographically, on their western side is Camp Road.
Absolutely.
On their eastern side is Blair.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk about a juxtaposition.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That sums it up very well.
Yeah.
And that was the conflict and the crisis that QC was sort of struggling to deal with.
Yeah.
Of course, the Methodist Church was in the background there, and they were having their own issues.
Yeah.
This was when Reverend Edwin Taylor had just come to the Bahamas, and there's a story all of its own in that. He was a black
That's
man
right.
from the Caribbean, and he was thrust into the leadership position here, where before, the white Bahamians and white Englishmen had dominated this sector. And I must say, Reverend Edwin Taylor, incidentally, was very supportive of me personally.
Oh, good.
During my whole crisis at Queen's College.
Yeah.
He was also a very, very scholarly theologian, if you will.
He was.
And I do believe bringing a wider perspective from his personal background in the Caribbean. But, as we move forward and we look at the social change that you would have encountered, being probably among the early persons who would have gone to Queen's College as a person of color. The same thing happening in a parallel fashion at St. Andrews.
Yeah.
You had been a part of GHS, if I will.
No,
St. Augustine's.
St. Augustine's, yeah.
St. Augustine's.
St. Augustine's, yeah.
But the one school that we had where, despite color, was GHS, government, which people now refer to as the government high school.
Yep.
And so when you look at all of this, this is something that I think that a lot of young people today don't truly appreciate, even the struggle for education for persons of color.
Mm-hmm. Yep. No, you're absolutely right. And if I recall correctly, I think your cousin, was it Raleigh?
Raleigh, my brother.
Your brother, your cousin.
My cousin, yes.
Was the first person of color to go to St. Andrews, I believe, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's right.
In 67.
And we like Queen's College, only had we were totally under the British system.
Right.
Our educational system was British, but all of the teachers in both St. Andrews and Queen's College were all from Great Britain.
Right.
But as we move forward, I think one of the things that we need to also speak to is how, in your opinion, do you think that impacted us as a society?
Well, let me make the point that by the time I went to QC, which was in 1969, it had developed a pretty advanced state of racial integration for a couple of reasons. One was that the PLP was now in power. And as you know, education became the top priority for the PLP.
Right.
And it tied scholarships and grants to schools to integration. So in other words, don't come to us for any assistance if you're practicing racial segregation. Added to that, there was a new headmaster who was responsible for my expulsion, actually, eventually, ironically, Reverend Neville Stewart, who was a very radical, socialist-minded English Methodist minister. And he and Cecil Wallace Whitfield were as thick as thieves. I mean, they were incredibly close.
Wow.
And the story, for example, that the famous schools that don't have windows.
Yeah, Stephen Dillett,
that this was
Uriah McPhee.
This idea was inspired by Reverend Neville Stewart. They were very, very close. And had Cecil stayed in the PLP, there's no doubt that Neville Stewart probably would have become director of education.
Interesting.
But he was a very radical guy. And actually, I was quite fond of him because he was of a like spirit, really. And he's the guy who made me head boy. In those days, you didn't run for election. You were appointed head boy by, the headmaster.
He appointed you and disappointed you.
Exactly. very, very, very much so. Very much so. But I think that, looking back, there were clearly some external forces at work. As I said, the main one, I think, is the fact that there was a change in government in '67, which and the new government very aggressively pursued
education,
a policy of complete desegregation of the school system and tied that to government support. Mm-hmm. And that in turn, acted as a stimulus for the schools to expedite integration. So if you look at QC in '66, or 65, and look at it in 1970, it was almost 50-50 by then.
But, interestingly enough, I mean, here we are 50 years later. We're on the precipice of actually celebrating 50 years as an independent country. And many would say that we've achieved many things. But one of the challenges that you had as a 16-year-old was the fact that you could give me all the facts about the Tudors and the Victorians and the Thames. And today, we still, I would like for you to expound on this. Have we actually reached a point in history where Bahamians understand the history of the Bahamas?
No history.
Absolutely not. No, not at all. It's probably worse now than it was before, because there's so many, external influences, pressing upon, Bahamian consciousness with social media and all of these other, foreign cultural influences. And I find that it's an abysmal level of ignorance out there, Bahamian history. When I got involved in politics, I had, looking back, probably something of the same concern, because the political history that the PLP taught really began with your grandfather, Milo Butler. You didn't hear anything about what came before Milo Butler. And I think that was because the leaders of that had themselves hadn't really been exposed.
True.
So this has been a problem that we've been dealing with for, through generations.
So when you talk about the Milo Butler, and, us sometimes saying, history seems to have began in 1967. I think that when you talk about the Dilletts and you talk about the A.F. Adderleys and you talk about all of those persons of color who would have actually entered the House of Assembly before Milo Butler, it is so important that while we know that our grandfather did a lot, that he was a huge social consciousness, if you will, there were other Black people, there were other persons even of what we would call the brown hue or the colored hue who stood for social justice. And, I think you said in a discourse recently, and I wanted you to expand on this a bit, when you said that maybe back then, you might have gotten a few things wrong with regards to what the British actually did for us in terms of assisting us to get to independence. Would you like to share a little bit more
I think
about that?
If you read the governor's dispatches, in the governor's dispatches, there's a huge archive of these at the archives department here, and they go all the way back to the 1600s, believe it or not, even to the proprietary period, all the way up to independence. And the governor's dispatches were basically correspondence back and forth between the governor here and the colonial office in London. And they were able to speak very frankly and openly because they realized that these were privileged communications. They weren't going to get in the public domain. So they spoke very frankly. And so, for example, you would see that during the period of your grandfather, when he first got involved in the late 30s, there was a lot of correspondence back and forth about, how corrupt and awful this electoral system is. And they talked about how, Somalia was the victim of, bribery and coercion and all these other things, and how they revoked his credit at the bank and all of these things. So there's a lot of sympathetic discussion there.
Interesting.
But more than sympathetic discussion, you could see that, it started the wheels turning in the heads of the decision makers of the Colonial Office in London. And if you look at all of the major political changes that took place here in the 20th century, up until the time of independence, nearly all of those were inspired by the British. They were not homegrown things.
Interesting.
For example, the getting rid of the property vote, getting rid of the company vote. Those were the direct result of intervention by the British.
That is...
And what you see, the one lever they always had, they said, look, if you all don't pull up your socks and reform yourselves and come out of the medieval period, we're going to make you a crown colony. And they were terrified of that, because a crown colony, technically speaking, is a colony where the British rule directly. You can keep your House of Assembly, but we'll come in here and we will actually run the government.
Oh my goodness!
Forget about this thing of having to depend on grants from the Assembly. We will run the country. And so they always threatened that. And whenever they did that, the local oligarchy tended to back off.
So generally, the news, if you will, that traversed between Great Britain and the Bahamas was directly linked to the actions of the Milo Butlers, of the folks, because when they talk about the Burma Road riots, which they described actually as being a riot,
right.
I guess all of this would have been corresponded back to the Home Office.
Absolutely. I'll give you an example of how it worked. In 1938, your grandfather ran for the first time for the House of Assembly and lost, got slaughtered by Harry Oakes. And the pro-Harry Oakes electoral machine was so finely oiled, he didn't even campaign. He was in London for the whole time, I think on vacation, never came back. He left everything to his main man of business here, who was his lawyer, A.K. Solomon, Sir Kenneth Solomon, who was at the time the ruling political figure in the Bahamas, the most influential political figure. But it was such a shameful, over-the-top travesty, involving the most blatant bribery.
Wow.
There's a very famous story that's quoted of some guy who very triumphantly brought a £2 note home to his wife, and she apparently was so outraged that he'd been bribed that she took her shoes off and beat him all through the town, right? Wow. But anyway, it was, the bribery was just out of this world. But the following year, when Harry Oakes was elevated to the Legislative Council and had to give up his seat in the House, there was a fresh by-election, and your father got in.
That's correct.
Right?
That's correct.
And people were a bit annoyed that Harry Oakes had done that, because the Western District was one of the few constituencies which had always been dominated by black representatives. And so even in that election, I think his opponent was Dr. Rogers, I think.
Probably, yeah.
And he beat Dr. Rogers. But again, I think it was because, I mentioned that because I think it was mainly because of the egregious instances of bribery in the election the year before that inspired a move towards a much more acceptable system of electioneering. And I think it was the first election that used the secret ballot.
Yeah,
in 1939.
I must say, because I sent you an excerpt from a book recently, absolutely, which we must get our hands on, which actually spoke to this. Yeah. And I think that herein is probably a part of, our history that sometimes post-67, if you will, there was a lot of anti-white, anti-colonialism, anti all of this stuff. And I wanted to get this in here because we now see that the British were not, should not be portrayed as negatively as, right after our transition that we do verbally, if you will.
I think the British have to be viewed at two levels, though. I think there was a lot of racism practiced by British citizens who were living here.
Yes.
Okay? And that tended, unfortunately, to radiate out so that people formed the view that all English people were racist prejudiced.
Got you. Okay.
But if you look at the Englishmen who were here at the official level, either as governors or right below the level of governors, colonial secretary, and even more so, the English officials in London who were sort of managing the Bahamian desk, so to speak. That's where I think you find the more progressive, the more reformist forces at work.
That's great clarity. Yeah. I think that's great clarity.
So we think about that, Mr. McWeeney. Help me understand. Talk about your observations of independence. 50 years on, I see obviously we are now in charge of our own governance. But when I hear you talk about the fact that the history, we still don't talk about Bahamian history. What have been your observations? Where have we made progress and where have we not from where you stand, being a member of Unicon, and where we are now?
I think there's a lot that we can be very proud of and a lot of great things that we have accomplished. One, I think we have developed a sense of our unique identity in the global community.
Yep.
And we've done very well, I think, at positioning ourselves as a part of what I call the non-aligned world, right? There are obviously a lot of pressures on us from, the big superpowers to align with them, to be in lockstep with them. But I think we've resisted that, all through the years. And, we have become a significant voice in many areas of international affairs. Most recently, for example, on the whole climate change thing, where Prime Minister Davis has become a recognized spokesman for this cause at the global level. So I think we've done very well in things like that. We've also done very well in terms of the institutional strengthening of the Bahamas. All of the major institutions that we take for granted now, national insurance, Bahamas Air, the Development Bank, Broadcasting Corporation, there's about 20 of them.
Yep.
All of these are basically post-independence creations, And so clearly that part of the agenda has been, essentially fulfilled. However, I think where we have fallen down is that I think we're still a very tribalized society.
No question.
And one of the great aims of independence, is to create a sense of national identity that transcends, partisan differences, that sort of thing. But we're very tribalized. And if you look at the way governments have operated over the last 50 years, it's as if every 5 years, and we tend to change governments every 5 years, you put one half of the national brain to sleep.
Yep.
And what I mean by that is that you start off from a position where you're fairly evenly divided anyway, half PLP, half F&M. But when the F&M gets in, they don't want to have anything to do with PLPs. They don't want PLPs to be involved in governance at all. And correspondingly, when the PLP get in, they do pretty much the same thing.
Well, let's just stick a pin there.
There are exceptions.
No. What I wanted to say was, and when you talk about political maturity and putting the other half of the brain to sleep, I must say that, if there's one thing I do admire about our current Prime Minister, Brave Davis, and I hope that this is continued as we move forward. Even though I'm out of frontline politics, my political life has been aligned with the Free National Movement. And, for him to actually, if you will, reach across the aisle and bring me in and say, listen, and not just me, there are others. There are others. And I love that because we have got to begin to have a unified Bahamas. That's the only way we're going. We're too small to be so tribal.
Absolutely. There have always been exceptions, even going back to Sir Lyndon. Sir Lyndon very famously brought in Sir Geoffrey Johnstone, who was the last leader of the UBP.
That's right.
And Bobby Simonet.
Tell me more.
To be members of the Hotel Corporation.
That's true.
Which at the time was one of the most important government corporations. But he caught hell for that.
As
I mean, his own
does
colleagues
any other
told him,
party leader.
don't you dare do that again,
Wow.
right? Because they said, I mean, to them that was treason. You know, how dared you reach beyond your own party to bring in the enemy into your bosom?
Yeah.
And it was really such an immature point of view, but it really was the prevailing thought back then. And so you find that I think we've matured a great deal since then, but. Pending, I think, was so chastened by it, he didn't really try it again.
He was afraid to do it again.
He was afraid to do it again.
And subsequent prime ministers.
Well, Hubert Ingraham, to his credit, I mean, I've always been a PLP. Hubert Ingraham, to his credit, made me chairman of the Judicial Review Commission.
And you did an excellent job. I just wish we could dust it off.
When they had to restructure the police force, I mean, he also he and Frank Watson made me chairman of that. So I must say that there have always been exceptions.
Well, I think
but
that
it doesn't happen enough.
Yeah.
As we move forward over the next 50 years, I think that, it would behoove us as a country to always bring our best forward, whether they're overseas, whether they're on the other political side of the divide, wherever they are. This is the only way, I believe, we are going to actually have a strong Bahamian identity to begin to identify who we are, because we're still unsure, I think.
And we're too small a country.
I agree.
To have this kind of divisiveness. It makes no sense, really. Yeah. So I think we all have to develop a level of political maturity that enables us to see beyond these partisan divides.
Well, you're a good man because
merit,
you're a good man, because I think all political parties have seen the benefit of utilizing your brain thrust. I wanted to ask you, though, as a much younger person in the political field, but having been the confidant of persons at every level of the PLP, what are your recollections of our grandfather, Samailo? Do you have any at all?
I had very little personal interaction with Samailo because when I was sort of coming in, he was starting his exit. But he was, an iconic figure. I mean, he was in a class by himself. He was truly the most iconic, most heroic figure I think the PLP has ever had. And the PLP was very, very proud to have him as a part of it because, initially he wasn't a PLP. They didn't want anything to do with the PLP. Yeah. Like many other black Bahamians at the time, they were very suspicious about these mulattoes, these red guys. What were they really after? Did they just want acceptance from the white power brokers or what? So he was very reluctant to join, but he wasn't alone. I mean, Adi Hanna took the same cautious approach and didn't join until much later on. Paul Adley was the same way. There were a number of black Bahamians who didn't. But by the time the 56 elections rolled around, Samailo was fully on board, right? He was always known to be his own man. My only encounter with him was actually after I was thrown out of QC. I worked for a time at the Bahamas Federation of Trade Unions. And my task really was just a very inglorious one, to just take notes at these meetings. And he was Minister of Labor at the time. And I was taken along by, I think it was Catterall and Briston and Philip Smith, who were the leaders of the Airport Workers Union, which was a part of the Bahamas Federation of Trade Unions. And Samailo, the two things that made me remember this so vividly, one was that Samailo conducted the conciliation meeting in person, which was very unusual for a minister. And this was a case of some porter who had done something which had resulted in his being sacked by Pan American Airways, as it then was. And the head of Pan American was there, big-time American guy. And Samailo was there, very patiently taking notes, listening to it. And all of a sudden at the end, he just turns to the Pan Am guy, this white American, and he says, "Where is your heart? Where is your heart?" And in a very loud, booming voice.
And he was a big man.
Big man. And the guy was, immediately flushed. He went totally red, right? And he proceeded to lecture him. He says, in life, it's not just going by the book, It's just, you have to have a heart. Where's your compassion? This is a man who has a family. You've thrown him out into the street. That's the appeal he took to him. Wow. And it worked. The guy agreed to take him back. And then I thought it was over. And then he turns to the guy, the porter, and he says, "Let me tell you something, young man. If you have to drink water. right? And then with that, he stormed out.
Oh my
And
goodness.
I only found out afterwards, like, because I asked Philip Smith, I said, what was that about, the thing about drinking water? He says, well, apparently the guy did have a bit of a drinking problem. And so Milo had obviously heard about this. And so that was his farewell message to him. But it showed the kind of, a couple of things about him. First of all, the hands-on approach that he had to problems. He didn't delegate these things to civil servants. And also, of course, one of his trademark qualities, which was compassion.
Yeah.
And taking the side of the small man against the big man.
Absolutely.
You know,
But still not giving them right for doing wrong.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
That's the point. Exactly. That's a key message there. But you know, as I said, he was in a class by himself, and PLP history, as I said, really began with Milo Butler. You know, there was no history you heard about that predated the late 1930s, and it usually began with the story about how he went up against Goliath.
Yeah, sorry.
In 1938, lost, came back in 39 and won, and was just an outspoken man who just didn't compromise. I mean, there were so many legendary stories which were true about Sir Milo, how, for example, he just stormed into the Royal Bank of Canada, which was the only bank back then, the only clearing bank, and said, you know, he wanted to see the manager, and the manager wouldn't come out. So he said, okay, I'll address him from here.
Yeah, exactly.
He stood at the counter in a booming voice.
Exactly. And then the guy came out and he said, I just want to know why is it that there's nobody behind this counter who looks like me, except the janitress.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that took a lot of nerve. One time he carried Pending with him, and Pending said he was terrified because he wasn't used to this. You know.
Yeah.
Well, I think also, you know, when you hear persons like Pauline Allen, you know, speak to the fact, I think that she was probably one of the first, if not the first, Black person to become employed at RBC, and to be grateful for the actions of Milo Butler. Yeah. But also, you know, Mr. Pending, I'm sure in his own rights was a very courageous man, but, you know, he was very small compared to Milo Butler of that day in terms of size.
Very much so.
And so I'm sure he would have also been comforted by the fact that, you know, there was a big man in front of him, you know.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But, you know, it's these sort of impactful stories, I feel, that we as Black people, we as Bahamians, we all need to understand that, you know, this is how we have got to teach and tell our stories, just like the Jews continue to tell their story, so that we can gain a strong sense of identity in moving forward over the next 50 years.
Well, that's the thing, you know, that was what was so unique about Sir Milo, was that whilst there were other influential Black leaders of the 30s and 40s, what was distinctive about him was that he moved from a position where his compassion, his social compassion, was informed by a great sense of righteousness, of what was right and what was wrong.
Yeah.
You had people like L.W. Young, for example, who was very much an opportunistic type politician, who certainly was not in the same category at all. He was a guy who was driven more by expediency than principle, whereas Sir Milo was driven by this overarching, you know, desire to be an instrument for the true progress of the Black Bahamian.
I also wanted to introduce a bit more about your personal life, if you don't mind. You know, you have a phenomenally beautiful wife.
Thank you.
She was, well, of course, I mean, she was Miss Bahamas. Yeah. Your grandmother, the late Pearl Cox, was probably one of the original committee members of the Miss Bahamas committee. So I know you have a great eye for beauty. But of course, her father as well would have been a large figure in life, in Bahamian life. But I want to know, did you both enjoy the political life, or did you introduce and influence her in that? Because she became a senator in the Bahamas as well.
Yeah, when we met, and let me say, next year will be our 50th.
Wow.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Married, married for 49 years. Started very early, you know. Yeah.
I like that.
But Sip, actually, we met each other when I think we were 18 or 19, something like that. And she wasn't very much involved in politics then. I was, of course, a big part of radical politics with Unicom. But she'd come from a political tradition because her father, Freddie Munnings, was, as you know, in addition to being a leading, entertainer and singer and impresario, all sorts of things, he was a leading political figure. And, he had done very well for a long time, and he provided a lot of money to the PLP, provided, the Cat and Fiddle as the place for conventions, this sort of thing. And he was a true believer. I mean, he really believed in the cause of majority rule. So she came from that tradition, was very much a part of it. But Sip, I can tell you, Sip for Cipriano, is much more of a politician than I am.
Really?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Sip eats, drinks, and sleeps politics. There's a sort of routine in my house that if I'm home and the House of Assembly is on, we will never be in the same room because she watches it gavel to gavel. I'm serious. And running commentary on it too.
Wow.
She's there, telling us when he's making a good point, telling us when he's talking foolishness. She's very interactive viewing. So she is really much very involved politics. She's a stalwart counselor of the PLP.
But your lives complemented each other so well in that regard.
Well, she was never really interested. When I met Sip, she wasn't interested in my type of politics.
I got you.
Unicom. She was never part of Unicom. She became much more involved later on when I became involved with the PLP, because we would go to Family Islands together, campaigning, and she always liked that part of the political experience. But I mean, she just loves politics.
And you have 3 children.
Yep.
Yes.
You have 2 daughters.
Yes.
You have a son who's walking in your footsteps, Sean Jr.
Yep.
Very charming young man. Is he going to be following in your footsteps otherwise?
I don't think any of my kids have any real interest in politics. I mean, it remains to be seen what the future holds. But I don't think, both my daughters are teachers. They're educators. And so that is a very consuming thing for them. That said, neither of my daughters have ever had any interest in politics. I think if of the 3, the one who's probably likely to be more interested is my son, Sean. But I think he's interested in more cutting edge things like, data protection, data privacy. Yeah. He has a real passion for that.
And
the whole thing, robotics
we see him
and IT.
Actually working very closely with Franklyn, part of the technology team.
Has become one of his mentors. I think he thinks the world of Franklyn.
Yeah.
And has told me how much he's learned.
But it's interesting because I think that after all that you've been through, you've never been a candidate.
Oh no! I always had an aversion to frontline politics.
You've never been a candidate, but you've always had the opportunity and you've embraced it.
Yes,
and we've used you in very key ministries.
Yeah, I was very close to Sir Lyndon, and Sir Lyndon was always trying to trick me into running. Right? He even got caught out one time because I was chairman of the party, and the Tribune one day published photographs of these huge signs which had been painted, said Sean McWeeney, PLP candidate for Centerville. This is when Perry had been alienated from the party.
In the 84,
yeah,
around
and
83, 84.
I went to Sudan. I said, "What's this about?" He says, "No way, I'm not running." And I was never interested in frontline politics. I did try it once at his insistence. I went into Oaks Field, which at the time was represented by Philip Pinder, but Philip had basically gone to the States and wasn't coming back. He'd lost interest. And so Tommy Turnquist was the MP, and the PLP needed somebody. I think I was in cabinet by this time. And I lasted for 2 weeks.
Wow.
I did a house-to-house campaign for 2 weeks. And I said, no way. Because that first week, I mean, I was practically picked clean.
I can only imagine.
Yeah, and I just couldn't believe
the amount of need.
Yeah, and the brass of these people. They wanted you to. There was one woman whose daughter was getting married and wanted me to pick up the tab for the wedding. Right. Another one showed me her fridge, which had broken down. Wanted a new fridge, and told me what kind she wanted too. Every house, like they were sort of waiting for you, and they all had their own personal agenda.
Oh, absolutely,
and
absolutely.
Of course, I succumbed to none of this, but I said, "Look, man, this is not for me. I can't."
But Sean, Mr. McWeeney, the thing I struggle with.
Please call me Sean.
I hear so many of our politicians talk about these types of situations. is there any possibility of changing? I mean, because if we don't give,
unless there's a pact between the parties where they all agree to abide by it, it's going to be very difficult because it gives whoever's doing it a great advantage in a society such as ours, where you have a very cynical electorate.
Absolutely.
Where people think that politics is all about getting something for yourself while you can. That these guys are no good to begin with, right? So you might as well just ride them for what you can.
Mm-hmm.
So unless everybody agrees that they're not going to be a part of this corruption, it's going to be very difficult and that's what it is. It is really corrupt activity.
It is.
The idea of trying to get somebody to vote for you based on something material that you do for them,
Yeah, but and this is what I struggle with. I talk to a lot of my political friends as I mature myself, and we complain about the system. But I say, if you're in politics, you should be able to change the system. Is it really possible to change the system in politics?
Only if you really, because we've always had laws, and in more recent times, good laws to punish corrupt activity in campaigning. But it's really a dead letter.
Yeah.
But your personal
life, it's a pious
life,
expression, but
your
nothing
personal
more.
life, truly, I think, as we all know, you're a devout Catholic.
Yeah.
You're a family man. When you think about those things, you obviously have instilled values that when you saw that within those first 2 weeks, you decided you could not compromise your personal principles and values for that. I think that there are a few persons that actually would do that. I believe, and as we start to craft the way forward over the next 50 years, it is important for us to make sure that politicians do not promise the sky, the moon, the stars, and the sun, because it's through that people seem to think that they are owed these things from the politicians.
You're absolutely right. Yeah.
And they also believe that, all politicians have these endlessly deep pockets. Yep. And it creates a vicious cycle for me, I think, in trying to meet these needs.
This is where the corruption comes in.
This is where a huge part of the corruption comes into our political governance.
Yep.
And until we're willing to tell people, yes, I can do this, no, I cannot do this, as your MP, these are my priorities. Yep. And it's not to you as an individual, it's to my constituents and for the greater good, then we will continue to have this type of gimme, gimme, gimme society.
You're absolutely right. I think historically speaking, one of the great mistakes the PLP made in '67, when it was at the height of its popularity in the country, is that it didn't break the back of this patronage system, which it inherited from the UBP. The difference was that the UBP were able to keep this patronage system going out of their own pockets because they were incredibly wealthy men in many cases. And they were able to just build these personal fiefdoms. Like San Salvador is a good example, which was basically owned lock, stock, and barrel by Roy Solomon. Yeah. I mean, it was such, a lockdown political thing that the PLP didn't put a candidate up in '67. They knew there was a total waste of time because everybody was on the Roy Solomon's payroll. The problem was that when the PLP took over in '67, it was a party basically of poor men. There were exceptions like your grandfather and so on, but basically poor men. And they didn't have the personal resources to do it. So what did? They used the resources of the state.
Yeah.
So what happened was that suddenly the public service payroll ballooned.
Yep.
Because you had to create jobs for these people. Whereas in the old days, the guys could afford to hire you if they wanted to. The new guys couldn't do it, so they used the state to do it. And, same thing with, handing out contracts and so on. And of course, you now have 50 years of this mountain that's been created in the meantime with this kind of thing, right?
And a huge deficit to
we all
pay
have to
for
pay.
it.
Exactly. So, what has to happen, there needs to be a coming together of all of the political forces. It may be very naive even to hope for that, but where there are certain ground rules which are agreed, and there has to be some way of enforcing it. Because the problem, as I said, is that if somebody breaches this pact, they're going to be at a great advantage because the electorate here is I hate to say it's a very greedy electorate.
It is. And,
right?
you know, I think it's all about managing expectations. Like you said, it would be very, very difficult to do it. But until we begin to stop making these ridiculous promises and, you know, manage the expectations of the electorate, we will continue to be the victims, if you will, of this bloated public service,
right,
and
the attendant costs to go with it,
and the attendant costs that go along with it.
Absolutely.
So, Sean, just a question I have in terms of, you know, what do you tell people today about what does it mean to build a meaningful life? Obviously, you know, you are at the stage now where you're winding down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's important in life to have goals, things that you want to accomplish and that you actually set out to accomplish, rather than just having them as, you know, airy-fairy ideas floating around your head, right? And usually the things that you want to achieve, and the things I'm talking about achieving, are the things that have some enduring value, not like buying a car or buying a new house, right? And the things that you want to do in that regard usually spring from some larger sense of ideals or idealism that guides you, you know? And, you know, once you come from that frame of reference, I think it's a lot easier to manage going forward. I'll give you an example of somebody like that. You know, my wife, for example, we were talking about earlier, Cipriana. She is the patron this year of the Miss Bahamas, because this is the 50th anniversary of her becoming Miss Bahamas.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. But the thing that I always remember about that time, you know, was she had a choice of going to Greece, which was a big thing back in 50 years ago, for 2-3 weeks as a part of the Miss Universe pageant. Or she could have stayed here, give all that up to be here for independence. And it was a no-brainer for her.
She's patriotic.
She stayed here because she just wanted to be here for independence.
Amazing.
I wonder if you gave that same choice to people today, how many would do it?
Yeah.
But it was because, I mentioned that because, you know, that was the mindset that she came from. To her, you know, it was a very important thing. You know, I was thinking about this in another context recently, where Dame Marguerite was being interviewed on television. And the person interviewing her only wanted to talk about how she was number 16 best dressed in the world. And Dame Marguerite was like, yeah, fine. Yeah, I mean, that's no big thing. I want to talk about independence.
Absolutely.
And again, it's because it's the mindset. You know, she's not a fashion plate. I mean, she's that, of course, but it's a very minor part of her persona. Yeah. You know, she's a very serious public figure with very serious ideals that she wants to talk about. And so Sip was the same way, and is the same way. So I mentioned that by way of example of what I'm talking about when I say that when you set out to achieve whatever your goals are, you can't do it in a vacuum.
Yeah.
It has to spring from a larger sense of purpose. Yeah. And once you have that larger sense of purpose, the things you actually do to achieve that purpose, you know, tend to fall in place a lot
So
more
what would
easily.
you like to see? I mean, I'm a young man coming up, and I ask myself this all the time. How do I live Samilo's legacy where I'm not given tuppence and pence in hospital, because that's not sustainable? It's, you know, I guess a risk from a safety perspective as well in our day and age. And I ask myself, for people like you who have spent these last 50 years, what does that legacy look like, you know, for young people?
It involves doing exactly what you're doing now and what you're doing, Loretta. And let me just say, I think your grandfather would be so very proud of both of you, you know, and your parents, because I think what you're doing, Franklyn, in the world of business, I mean, is tremendously powerful because there's so few role models like that out there. Somebody who is succeeding in business in a very diversified way in areas of the economy which are not traditionally associated with Black Bahamians.
Absolutely.
And doing it at the top level of the management and ownership structure. You're not some mid-level manager. You're the man who's in charge, who owns things and runs things, right? We need more examples like that. So I think the power of personal example is something that can't be underestimated. And so my answer to your question is to keep doing what you're doing in that regard, and to continue to combine philanthropy, social outreach, and other evidence of social compassion.
Yeah.
When I spoke the other night, I talked about Sir Franklin Wilson as being something of a template for this, where he too has succeeded handsomely in business, but he's also developed a tremendous record of philanthropy, particularly in the area of education. So I think marrying those two, and that's all you have to do.
And a third factor, if I might add, I think what I gather from a lot of this are also the strong family structures.
Agreed.
Each of the persons that we talk to that achieve these things, that have these strong convictions, also not only come from a strong family structure with a very strong, principled Christian background, but are also building their own families in such a way. We cannot move away from the fact that the family is the building unit of our society.
Absolutely.
And each one of these persons, whether it's Sir Milo, whether it's Sir Franklin, whether it's Franklin III, whether it's Sean McWeeney, we all share these common factors. I know everyone wants to be liberated. Everybody wants to be head of a household. We don't need a husband. We don't need a wife. I think those things are so integral to who we are as a people, and making sure that we remain grounded, focused, and convicted.
Absolutely. No question. And let me say, Loretta, you didn't allow me to get to you. I was talking about Franklin, right? But also in your case, to go back to Franklin's question, I think the fact of the matter is that you have been a real trailblazer in this society.
No question.
I think you were the first female leader of the opposition.
That's for sure.
The country has had. You have been an important part of the political space, not only as an MP, but as a cabinet minister, and more recently as a public servant. And I think, in that you're continuing your father's tradition as well. People forget that Sir Milo was a legendary figure, not only in politics, but also in the business world.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the things that he was able to do and the struggles that he had to endure at a time which was infinitely more challenging than it is today. Yeah. When there was one bank.
Yep.
That's right.
What do you do? What do you do when you're in business and there's only one bank in town?
Yeah.
And the bank calls you up and says, "We're revoking your credit."
Yeah, you're done.
You see? But the fact is that he was able to withstand that. He was able to develop a network of relationships with important business people quietly, but in ways that enabled him to survive. These are important life lessons. Yeah. And so I think in both your cases, Franklin and in the area of business, and you primarily, although not exclusively, in the area of politics and public service, I think they represent the two major strands of the legacy of Milo Butler. And speaking of your father, by the way, sorry, I just want to mention this one thing. I just found out recently that according to Paul Adley, who was usually very particular about these things, he actually said that the spark, the brain storm that led to the mace incident actually came from your father, Franklin.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
The what?
That the idea about throwing the mace out the window.
Oh.
That started with, he said Franklin Butler raised it.
Okay, because...
at the council, he was a member of the NGC, I think, of the party.
Remember, Loftus couldn't raise it. Remember when Uncle Loftus came, he said he couldn't raise it.
That's right. He for many reasons.
Exactly.
For many, many reasons.
Yeah. He was not a member of the House, your father, but he was a member of the NGC.
Yeah, so maybe they asked him to raise it instead of...
Yeah, actually, I think you'll find the story. It's actually in the book that was done on Sir Milo.
Yeah, okay.
It's in there. It's in there. Where it's Paul Adley reminiscing, and he says that the idea came from Franklin Butler.
Okay. But one thing I want to say without leaving Loretta, and this is one of the things why I've enjoyed doing this work so much, is the more I get to understand the history of our family, there's so many powerful examples of women leadership in our family, whether it's Sir Milo's mother. I think, I understand Loretta so much more, and even myself so much more. And I think that's actually why people maybe don't understand our relationship, because Loretta was one of the first people to kind of prick my consciousness about how, as a family, we tend to support men as opposed to the women. And so when Loretta kind of raised that with me, I said, listen, I'm going to make a special effort to make sure I do whatever I can. And when you see her work, and, I spend a lot of time now in public settings with her,
Right.
you really get the appreciation
Yes.
for what she means in this generation.
Yes, absolutely.
And how many young women, young men look up and say, Mrs. Butler Turner, thank you for what you've done.
You've been an inspirational figure.
And
You
I want
absolutely have
to
been.
echo.
Well, thank you. But I think, and I appreciate that very much, but I still think that as we look at moving forward over the next 50 years, and really carving out a stronger society, we must realize that there are fundamental values that we must embrace again, I believe. This is my opinion.
question.
To ensure that we have young people that are willing to understand how important it is to sacrifice, to work hard, to set goals, and to have conviction of mind. And of course, to also remember that there are principles that guide people who achieve great things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I couldn't agree with you more. And it goes back to this whole concept that we spoke about recently at the event that Sir Franklin and I did about this whole concept of service above self, which is something
I enjoyed that thoroughly.
sorely in need in the society today, where we live in an age where self-gratification
Yes.
We've heard
still
that a lot.
the center of everything. What's in it for me? What can I do to get myself move further ahead of everybody else?
Without regard for how we step on each other.
Exactly.
You know?
And that represents a change. I was in a discussion the other day where someone was talking about what was very much a part of the Bahamian culture 50, 60 years ago, that where somebody in a neighborhood was building a house, all of the neighbors would join in.
Yeah.
You're talking about that. If we cooked a pot of food,
if you
everybody got
if you
some.
do that today, the question would be, was that all about?
I remember
what was
on
he trying to
Sunday
get?
afternoons, obviously in our extended family life, we all gathered after church. We all ate. And all of the neighbors, we exchanged plates of food. This one might have made potato salad. The other one might have made peas and rice. But we lived as community. Everyone was able to, we knew each other as well. The Bahamas is still a very, very small population. We're still very interconnected. I think those are values that we need to try and strengthen again.
No question. So, Sean, 50 years later, a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being top, 1 being less than ideal, how do you rate the Bahamas?
On that sort of approach, I would say 6.5, maybe. 6.5. Certainly more than 5, but certainly, well short of 10. I think we have a long way to go. I think there's a lot we have accomplished, but certainly the magnitude of the problems we have, the diversity of the problems we have, there can be no room for resting on our laurels. There's just too much to be done out there.
As a scholar, if you got 6.5 out of 10, your grade will probably be borderline B minus C. Somewhere around there. A being the ultimate grade. What do we have to do to pull ourselves up to an A?
I think we need to develop a greater sense of who we are as a people. We need to look for ways that bind us together as a people, as opposed to not being able to see beyond the ends of our noses, where we're only thinking about ourselves and our families, right? Where you see this on display magnificently in a way that hopefully can be used for the wider society, the things we're talking about, is in the aftermath of hurricanes.
No question.
I think there was a film made of the heroic exploits of some men in Grand Bahama. Many of them with very questionable backgrounds. Some of them who we would regard as being, the worst of the worst, but who performed heroically
Absolutely.
And there was a film that showed them, they went out at great personal risk to themselves to rescue people.
On jet skis, etc.
Yeah, who on jet skis, exactly, who were people who were stuck in the attics or on the roofs of their homes. And I mean, that's a great example of how, without being asked to do it, there's just a spontaneous expression of a sense of community.
That's a great example.
A sense that you leave your own home.
Absolutely.
You leave your own home to go out there because you realize that your brother or your sister's in need, and that you have to, rise to the challenge of helping that person. The easiest thing in the world would have been for them just to stay home.
Yeah.
And don't
Make sure
get
they're
involved.
safe, yeah.
And nobody had to ask them to do it. They jump in their jet skis and they went and
That's a
help.
great example.
And so it shows that the impulse is there.
Yeah.
The feeling is there. The values are there. The problem is, how do you get those values brought to the fore so they're available not only in an emergency or in a crisis, but where they become a part of the fabric of one's daily life.
I love that. I love that.
No, I think that's a great example of the kind of thing that we have to find more of.
Yes, absolutely.
And being our brothers and sisters keepers, the well-being of our neighbors.
Yep. It's an old expression, being our brother's keeper, but it's still the thing which lies at the heart of all of the great things that this society's done. I mean, your grandfather, for example, that's what it was all about. If he wanted to, he could have just been a shopkeeper, a successful merchant, sending his kids off to the best schools, and just, relaxing with his money, right? But instead, he saw a wider need, and he responded to that need in a way that, caused him, great pain, involved great sacrifice.
Well,
so we need
to Uncle Frank. Uncle Frank obviously thought so too.
We need more Milo Butlers, and unfortunately they're in very short supply now.
Yeah.
So as we close out, I think this has, for me, and I knew this would be like this. This has been an eye opener for me from you, from an historical perspective, and I thank you. I really do thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And I hope that we can see, as we move forward into our next 50 years, more written scripts by yourself that are utilized in our educational system. I just wanted to say, speak to us as, and I think you've already done it, but if you can sort of encapsulate it a bit, about us giving service above self, because that was the topic that you and Sir Franklyn spoke to. But consistently, how do we do it?
I think it has to happen it has to start with the individual, at the individual level, or perhaps at the family level. How often do families sit down after a Sunday dinner, for example, after church or wherever, and say, what is it that we can do, even with all the struggles we may have as a family, what is it that we can do to make this community in which we live a better place? What is it? Let's just go around the table.
Interesting.
Right? To go beyond making speeches and say, what is it specifically we can do? There's a friend of mine, for example, who is actually an English woman, a lawyer, and they featured her on ZNS recently, actually featured her husband and children. She decided that as a family, they wanted to do something to help make the Bahamas a little cleaner. They were dismayed by the litter that they saw. So every week, as a family,
they go and clean up.
They just go out there. And one day, I think a crew from ZNS or somebody was passing. I said, "What are you all doing?" And they said, "Well, we're just cleaning up the garbage. That's what we do. We do this every week. The couple hours we set aside to do it, and they had their own garbage bags, and we see that the garbage is put away. That's a great example of one family.
You've just given me a phenomenal challenge.
I agree.
I want to challenge you as well, because this is, we know what it's like to gather on a Sunday afternoon. We know the purpose of that, but we're going to have a community dinner for the 50th anniversary in honor of Sir Milo. I think we as a family, the Butlers, can push that challenge out during that community dinner
to everyone,
for families, and we set the example to find ways that we can make our little communities a better place.
For sure.
And Loretta, this used to be something which families did so frequently back in the day, so to speak. You mentioned my grandmother earlier, Pearl Cox. She was a part of a group back in the 50s, I think it was, or the 60s. She was one of the founders of the Carver Garden Club. But out of that came an initiative which led to the creation of that fantastically beautiful stretch on Wolf Road that leads to the UB with the Poinciana trees.
Yeah, okay.
Poinciana trees.
Where they did that.
That's fantastic.
They planted the trees. And it's well documented. They had the press out there. And there wasn't anything in this for them apart from the sheer pleasure of doing something beautiful to enhance the physical environment. Yeah. And this was a group of women who decided just out of the blue, hey, this would be a great idea.
Absolutely.
And all you have to do is multiply things like that. Yeah. You know,
that's right.
10, 20, 30, 40, 100 cases like that.
Yeah.
And you're going to have
a huge difference.
A much better society.
And when you drive down Poinciana Drive,
that's the coolest, most comfortable
or Collins Avenue, or the Western Road, it seems like it's all been replicated.
I agree.
This time of year, it is the most spectacular drive to be able to see the flamboyance, you know, like an arch over your car.
There was a beautification committee that she was a part of.
Absolutely. So, you know, I think that as we move forward, I mean, I've really enjoyed this. You've actually challenged me personally, piqued my interest. I believe that we are going to have to challenge ourselves more than just doing this podcast to help educate and to encourage people to tell their stories. But we've got to do something even more tangible now.
Yeah. I think that's one for our dinner as we get our directors together.
So I want to thank you.
Thank you.
So, Mr. McWeeney, I just want to thank you for being a part of this show.
Thank you.
I'm always fascinated to just hear stories. You know,
thank you.
As I listen to the history and doing this podcast and hearing so many different perspectives, I myself would not have said I was a historian, but I can tell you I'm so much more engaged in hearing so much more as really I try to figure out what the next 50 years look like, because certainly while I don't believe politics is my path, I certainly believe that defining the next 50 years, whether that's in business or through philanthropy and through some of the community outreach that we continue to do as a foundation and as a family, we have to try to understand the history so we can build upon the next 50 years and make sure that when I'm on the other side of this camera and someone's asking me 50 years from now, what have I done or what would I make of our country? You know, I'm in a position to take some of the stories and build the bridge from what I call independence to where we are. Because I tell people I don't know Samailo. So oftentimes people think I know Samailo because I'm a part of this story, but I never knew Samailo. But I can certainly tell you my father made every effort. He used to say, just in case my head go cold, you need to know the story or you need to know this. And so I appreciate you, being there, the contribution you've made to our country.
Thank you.
Certainly the history that you shared today is one that I think more and more of our Bahamians need. And I'm going to encourage you, to continue to tell your story, man.
Thank you.
And to write it as well, because he's not fearful of writing.
Exactly. I thoroughly enjoyed the UB thing on idealism with you and Sir Franklyn. When I'm in that environment, I feel like I'm on my daddy's feet, where you literally could just spend all afternoon and just listening and taking notes of what it is. And I think that the more you can do, that'll be extremely helpful.
Thank you.
And I want to, as before we close out, and obviously give our thanks once again to our sponsors, and of course to our very special guest who just blown away today.
Thank you.
I just want to say that it's so interesting because, Franklyn was not here on this side when we turned 50 years ago when we became independent. And for him to actually be able to say, let's do this so that we're able to have a footprint as we move forward into the next 50 years. I just want to say thank you very much. I'm glad we're doing it together. But as we move forward, I believe you will continue to become that historian, so that you will one day write a book or we will all write a book. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. I've really thoroughly enjoyed it. The last 50 years have been a time of great challenge for us, but I don't think it's going to be anything compared to the next 50. I mean, you're talking about challenges. I just think, for example, of this whole climate change crisis that we're into now, where I mean, it's a really sobering thought when you consider that 50 years from now, the Bahamas, as we know it today, probably is not even going to exist.
I'm going to be
They're going to be islands
on Mount Alvernia. That's going to be the last thing that goes underwater.
That is a hell of a thought, when you realize that, you look at a map and you say, this is where I live, this is my country. Yeah. And you realize that some of those islands are going to be underwater.
Absolutely.
And then when you think of even more complex challenges, how do you go about creating a socially peaceful society where you have so many elements which are warring with each other?
Yep.
I mean, the whole issue of integrating the Haitian community into the larger fabric of the society. I mean, these are just two problems that come to mind.
That's right.
But the point is that the challenges are going to be very, very complex. They're going to be numerous.
Yep.
And we can't leave it to the politicians
to solve
them. It's going to take a collective effort.
Yeah.
So well said.
But I'm optimistic.
Absolutely. And you've not finished giving service yet, sir.
It's a great country.
So
and we're going to be even greater.
From the bottom of our hearts, the Butler Legacy Foundation, obviously the current today at Bahamar. We thank you. This has been amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing, Franklyn.
And to our guests who have continue to engage with us. We want to invite you to continue to follow us on YouTube, of course, on Apple Podcasts. We want you to know that we do these episodes to share stories, to enlighten, because we believe that to the challenges that we discussed today, that if you don't understand the context of our history, the challenges of the next 50 years are going to be unsolvable. And so we want to invite you to continue to follow us as we have great guests on the show and to continue to celebrate 50 years of independence. So we thank you to all those who continue to write to Loretta and I every week and tell us how much they've enjoyed the podcast. And again, Mr. McWeeney, we want to close by thanking you so much for being a part of this.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Loretta.
Thank you very much.
It's always a joy to have you.
Thank you. I appreciate you, cuz.